In 1987, in Porto Alegre, Brazil, a young drug dealer named Zé das Drogas experienced the love of Christ. He made a profession of faith in a Pentecostal church and committed his life to following Jesus. He knew he had to change his ways, and he wanted to do something to express that new love in Christ that he had experienced. He had a vision in which he felt that the Spirit told him to open a place where people like him could go to rest, recover, and regenerate. So he and his friends went and squatted on some private property near the downtown area in Porto Alegre. This is a city of about 2 million people. And soon his vision began to take shape as Vita, a precarious rehabilitation center for drug addicts and alcoholics. Now, he saw something beautiful, something that would regenerate people. But instead of this community of restoration, he discovered that soon police officers, hospital staff members, in both general and psychiatric hospitals, families and neighbors started dumping people at Vita. All manner of homeless, mentally ill, and dying people began showing up at Vita. Instead of regeneration, many of the folks in Vita simply waited with death. They weren't waiting for death. They were waiting with death because it was ever present in Vita. Zé's idealized vision wasn't the reality he experienced. Zé's reality was the hell of sitting with people who had lost any sense of identity. They'd even lost their names. No identification. All of it had been cast away by society. And there they were, dumped on the doorstep of this colony of death. Of course, the term doorstep is only figurative because most of Vita was outside. A Princeton anthropologist named Zhao Beal wrote about Vita in the 90s, and he wrote the following: "We found Vita situated on a hill of absolute misery, overcrowded with tents, a wooden chapel, and an inadequate kitchen. No hot water or bathroom facilities. About 200 men were living in the recovery area." He put that in quotes. There were some 150 people in the infirmary. The infirmary was separated from the recovery area by a gate policed by volunteers who made sure that the sickest couldn't freely wander around the hill. The sickest of Vita wandered around in the dust of their lot, rolled on the ground, crouched over or under their beds when they had one. Each one was alone and most were silent. There was a stillness there, a kind of relinquishment that comes with waiting for nothing, a nothingness that is even more powerful than death. Yet Beale's description is the big picture, and it's sometimes easier to bear suffering when we see it with a broad-angle lens. It's easier to hear about the miseries of something like Vita or this year, pandemic, the job losses, the loneliness, the isolation, all of the things that people have struggled with this year. It's a little easier when we keep it at arm's length, when we don't have to zero in and focus on somebody's individual story of pain. In Vita, there was a nameless woman, middle-aged woman who Beale encountered as he was writing about this. She was sitting in the infirmary's ground, crouched over a stream of urine, and as he approached, he could see that her head was full of small holes. Someone told him that bichinhos, or parasites, had invaded her flesh, and now she was living in Vita, waiting with death. Untreatable and discarded by society, she sits there until it overcomes her. Where did she come from? How did she get there? In stories like this, when I read about them, I think about Isaiah 64, especially that first verse. Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down. Our Hebrew lesson is a plea to God. It's a cry asking for God to come down and enact justice on behalf of those who don't experience justice in this lifetime. If God would tear open the heavens, then what? Then what happens? Are we prepared for what's next? Are we prepared to be participants in that story? Are we prepared, like Zay, to be grabbed by the Spirit and moved outside of our comfort zones to do something that we could never have imagined us doing? Can you imagine somebody approaching him months before his conversion experience and saying to him, dude, in a little while, you're going to have a vision and you're going to open up sort of a place for people to recover. Back when he was dealing drugs, he would have never been able to imagine that. But what about us? Are we prepared for what God might do? In Isaiah, when God tears open the heavens, mountains quake and nations tremble. In verse 3, we see a depiction of a hearkening back to some unnamed and unexpected, breathtaking deeds. It says, when you did awesome deeds that we didn't expect, you came down and the mountains quaked at your presence. Maybe the reference to mountains quaking refers back to Pharaoh and Exodus. That's a long distance from that woman in Vita. That's a long distance from us and whatever we're facing. The power of awesome deeds is the potential for those deeds to happen again. In the face of horrible suffering, it's only natural to wonder, where are you, God? Where are you? Where are you this year? Where were you as this virus spread? Where were you as people sat alone on this past Thanksgiving, wondering why they couldn't be with their families? Any time we could ask about those awesome deeds and say, why don't you tear open the heavens again? Why don't you do that? Now would be a good time. We use our freedom to react to God, to respond to suffering, or to ignore it. God's in the midst of it all when we react. God is always moving in us, trying to draw us from where we are to where God wants us to be. In verse 5, we see this strange reversal. Because you hid yourself, we sinned. Normally we'd see sin precede God hiding. But in this instance, the order appears confused. Did God hide and then we sinned? Or does Isaiah have it all mixed up? Rivard Childs writes about this passage. The power of this verse lies in the unexpected sequence. And it serves to identify the frustration of the confessing community. There's pain. There's suffering. We can find it frustrating when we discover those explicit instances of pain. When we read about a story from the 1980s or 90s, or when we see it firsthand, when we see the alienation or the isolation or the sense of dislocation, the people who have been pushed down, when we see it firsthand or see an account of it on the news, we can find it really frustrating. The statement in verse 5 is congruent with the intensity of the rest of the lament that follows. But we have to keep reading. We can't end in verse 5 and rest in that frustration, just like we can't watch the news, turn it off and say, gosh, that's terrible, and stop right there. We have to keep going. We have to keep reading, picking up the hope of God's presence in verse 8 and the claim that everyone is a part of God's people in verse 9. That deep sense of inclusion that doesn't leave anybody out. As a matter of fact, even though we find good news and the hope and claim at the end of these 9 verses, we carry that message forward in this Advent season. This season of intentional waiting. This season that we build into our calendar to get ready, to be able to look ahead, to see the glory of Christmas Day. We carry that hope to the birth we celebrate in just a few weeks' time. It's that Christmas birth that will take us into next year and whatever that next year brings. Through Lent, Holy Week, into the glory of Easter's resurrection, and beside the church calendar into whatever our world presents. There is hope. That hope is present in these verses. But what do we do with it? How do we take that hope and move it forward and live it out? How do we take that hope and let our lives represent it? Many years ago, a friend told me a story about an experience she had when she was visiting Argentina. She was this is her first trip to Argentina, and she flew into Buenos Aires, and she decided to take the bus to the university where she was going to be doing some work. And she was unfamiliar with the Buenos Aires bus system. So when she got on the bus, she explained to the bus driver where she needed to go, and she asked him if he would tell her when they reached her stop. He nodded and smiled. And so she went and sat down. And then the bus driver, there were only 2 other people on the bus. The bus driver proceeded to explain, because she had spoken softly to the driver. She didn't need this to be everyone's conversation. The bus driver turned around and explained to the 2 other people on the bus what she had just told him, and told them which stop that she needed to reach. And so then as the bus went along on its path, on its route, some people got off and others got on. And as new people got on, the other passengers continued telling my friend's story. Oh, she's going to be going to the university and she needs to know which stop it is. They smiled and everyone was staring at her. She felt pretty conspicuous at this point. Now the bus was fairly full and everyone was aware of where she was going, her story. She was new to Argentina. She was going to the university. And finally, as the bus was going around a turn, everybody on the bus shouted, "Esto es su parada." This is your stop. In Advent, it's important to carry the message forward. It's important to keep telling the story. Whether it's a story of hope that we find in the 64th chapter of Isaiah, or it's the story of hope that a baby born in a manger brings to a world that is in such desperate need of it. In this season, we celebrate this birth. We remember this message in its entirety. We don't leave out the more challenging parts. We don't leave out the difficult moments where Jesus' teachings push us out of our comfort zone and to do something we wouldn't maybe have normally thought about doing. We pass it along. We pass it along through our stories, through our songs. We pass it along in church, but this year, maybe more than any other year, we pass it along in our homes, like you right now. And we continue to pass along these stories so that we can more fully live into God's calling for us. So that we can be God's hands and feet in a world that needs them. Even in the midst of horror and suffering, when it appears God is absent, we carry the message forward. God is present and we are God's people. But just like with each passenger on the bus, passing the message along is as important as knowing when to get off. Esto es mi parada. This is my stop. Amen.